Thanks for 3 great presentations. So now we're going to open it up to the audience for questions for any of our presenters or all 3.
I have a question for, this is Mark Hatzenbuehler. I have a question for Dr. Salmivalli. Thanks for a great presentation. I was wondering if you could talk about how much you target the bystander messages to be specific to address the individual groups that are most at risk for bullying. Because I was thinking that potentially sort of broad bystander messages may not be effective for addressing specific vulnerable populations like youth with disabilities or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender individuals. So I just wondered if you could talk about that that tension between kind of broad messages versus more tailored messages. And then secondarily, I was curious if you look to see whether or not the intervention has been effective in reducing disparities among groups that are particularly vulnerable within the Finnish context.
Okay, so about the first question, whether we have more broad or tailored messages to bystanders trying to change their behaviors, or whether well, our intervention that I mentioned, the KIVA program, there we are really using a school-wide universal student curriculum approach when we are addressing bystanders. So that's the thing, rather than trying to find those groups or classrooms that are most risk for, developing harmful processes and so on. I know, however, that, for instance, in the Netherlands, in René Wenstra's group, where they are evaluating the KIVA program, they have also tried to a little bit different approach where they are using network analysis for individual classrooms and trying a more tailored approach to this classroom intervention. But yeah, we are using the broad message, and I think that, well, you might think that there are groups that are more at risk and that there are groups that need to be targeted specifically, but I think that in many groups there are so many different individual children, and there are those who you might be able to, how you say it? Well, there are potential defenders in many different groups, and even if you think that there is a group that might be at high risk for frequent bullying behavior, there are also individuals who are easier to target than others, and in most groups there are actually students that have deep inside attitudes that are against bullying, and the question is how to make them express their attitudes in private and to be in public and to be courageous enough to really act upon them. So, yeah, I think that even if our intervention and the message is quite broad, it's still quite specific to many kids who can identify with the different things that we are doing in the exercises and in the student lessons.
Thank you, Tina.
What was your other question?
The second question was just, I don't know what the epidemiology is in the Finnish context, but if there are, in fact, particular groups that are at disproportionate risk for bullying, whether the KIVA intervention has been effective in reducing those disparities, just given some research showing that effective interventions at a population level can actually exacerbate inequalities. I was just curious about whether or not you've examined the effectiveness in reducing disparities in bullying victimization.
Well, we have done some specific studies where we have looked at several at-risk groups or several, for instance, we have looked whether the program is also effective for bully victims, who are the really highly problematic group of kids who bully others but are also victimized by others, and typically there is this idea that they are really hard to change, or their plight is really different from the others, but actually shown that we can also positively influence bully victims and reduce their prevalence. Also, there is a recent study that we have just submitted, which is actually Jaana Juvonen in the United States was the one who was with her group analyzing our data and looking whether the kids who were the most vulnerable and who were most victimized, most frequently victimized prior to the intervention, whether we were able to influence their levels of depression, self-esteem, and perceptions of the school climate. And actually we were able to show that that was the case. I mean, we haven't looked at specific groups, for instance, like LGBT youth or immigrants or racial minorities, because in Finland they are really, really few. We are a very heterogeneous population. But yeah, we have looked at bully victims, and we have looked at those who were victimized the most, and we're able to show that they are the ones who really gained in self-esteem and decreased in depression and improved their school climate perceptions.
Okay, other questions?
So this is Fred Rivara. I have a question, maybe start with Karin, but really for all three of you. So the title of this committee is Biological and Psychosocial Effects of Peer Victimization. And what I'm concerned about is, or not concerned, but puzzled now is, if you talk about the fluidity of the roles, what are the implications of that for the effects of bullying and victimization?
Well, when we're talking about fluidity, we're really talking about the specific events, and it's essentially what part of it you're looking at, because even within those fluid patterns, we do see consistencies, and perhaps the most fluid people are the bully victims. So both of these aspects are absolutely true, and when we're looking at effects, we do see that the kids that have the most involvement are the ones who are the most seriously affected. The other thing that I would mention is that the effects on bystanders, which are probably going to vary a tremendous amount by the type of intervention they do, because the way they intervene has very specific effects, seems to be very tightly connected to their self-identity and how their friend responds. So we have these consistencies in the midst of a lot of chaos to someone who wanders onto the playground for the first time, and it tells you why this is such a difficult process to intervene in the moment. Teachers go onto the playground and they feel a great sense of confusion. They look at kids who are frequent bullies and they may not see the victimization that also occurs. So this is why entire school programs that really look at prevention on a broad base is really helpful, because it's very hard to go in and wade in and say, okay, this is the bad guy, this is the good guy. It doesn't work that easily. I'm not sure I answered that precisely the way you wanted it, Fred.
Can I say something about that? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Sorry, is Christina, is that you speaking first?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I was just thinking that I don't believe in fluidity so much between bully and victim roles, for instance. I know that there are these kids who are doing both, but in our data, which is mostly peer report data on how each student is typically behaving, they are very clearly distinct roles, and those who are both perpetrating bullying and who are the targets, they are really a small group. I wonder if this fluidity is more seen when you do observations, because with observations I think that you tap aggressive incidents and you identify aggressive moments when someone is aggressing against someone else. And I think that that might be a bit different and not necessarily always what I would call bullying. That's what comes to my mind.
And this is Wendy speaking. I think I would answer that by saying I think there is less fluidity among those who are chronically victimized or chronically bullied, that those are the most at risk. Those are the ones that we're seeing the most negative effects upon. I think there's more fluidity among those that it happens once a term. So I think, and the same thing is that I think the message that I have is that there's a negative impact on those who bully, those who are victimized, and those who experience both, and also on those who witness it, and more significantly, those who actively intervene. And all of those, the negative impacts are influenced by the chronicity at which they experience the behavior or the chronicity in which they do the behavior.
Other questions?
Can I speak to that again? I just wanted to mention that this also speaks to the tendency of the human mind to come up with easy ways of characterizing other people. Whether you're peers or whether you're teachers, you have a tendency to categorize people into one specific role. And those roles are both true because there are patterns, but they influence people so that they don't see other aspects of that person's role or other aspects of that person's experience. And I think Christina is absolutely right that the methodological ways of looking at this have a big effect on whether you see different parts of that or whether you tend to zero in on a specific pattern.
Other questions from the panel?
I have a question from Tracy Viancourt. How robust is the finding that girls tend to be defenders? Do Karin and Tina also find this in their studies? If so, how can we engage boys to stand up and not stand by?
This is Christina speaking. Yes, we have always found that girls tend to be defenders more often than boys.
So how can you,
however,
the
maybe
boys to
to
stand
the other
up?
part of your question, that how we can mobilize boys to be defenders more. I think that what is also important is that boys tend to be reinforcing and rewarding the bullies more than girls. And it seems, according to some of our studies, that actually making reinforcing less common is equally important, and it's really important for the reduction of bullying behavior. Even more that, like in our mediation study that I mentioned, and also in some other classroom level cross-sectional studies, it seems that whether there is less reinforcing, that was can effectively reduce bullying. So it's not even necessary to make everyone defenders. Was I clear? Yeah, the point was that less reinforcing may be enough in many cases.
That's a really important point. The other aspect of this is that boys may defend in different ways, and this depends a lot on school culture. So, for example, in one high school we were at, the boys had developed a culture in which when one of their friends was under threat, a friend would immediately rush over to them and hold them back physically. And this was a very powerful demonstration that you were being a good friend. Kids felt very proud of this. They felt like heroes. They would sneer, "He's not worth it." In other words, don't retaliate. And so this was this was a specific culture that had arisen in this school all on its own, and it fit with the kind of hero narrative that is often a part of being a defender. And it also is consistent with what we see in that much defending occurs on a physically aggressive level. But what we find is that when kids are actually taking revenge on behalf of their friends, it's has a very mixed effect in terms of they feel like a good friend, but they also feel very guilty about that. So different kinds of defending, I think, is more characteristic of boys and girls.
So I just want to shift the conversation for a minute and make it's more of a comment than a question, but it's something that you said, Karin and Wendy, in your presentation. So I think, Wendy, when you didn't have a lot of time to talk about the diversity of the teaching force and the diversity of the community and the schools, but that's such an important point because what we're finding is that it really, in studying victimization, it's really not about the ethnicity. So studies that have tried to say, are African American kids more likely to be victims than white or Asian or immigrants? That's not really the issue. It really is the ethnic composition, whether you're a racial or ethnic minority in that particular context. And I think that's an incredibly important point to make when we start thinking about race and the experience of victimization. And the point you made, Karin, about culturally relevant interventions, I don't think any, in other fields in work on academic achievement, there's a lot of focus on culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally relevant interventions to help kids do better in school academically. I don't think there's any work on culturally relevant interventions dealing with victimization that take into account the cultural norms and the cultural meaning of retaliation or reciprocity, the way you've talked about that. So I think that's incredibly important to study also. Shall we ask questions from the audience?
I have a question from the webcast listener. This is from Dr. Melissa Mercado, and she said, thank you for sharing your excellent work. I'm Dr. Melissa Mercado, and my bullying prevention research has been focused on the role of connectedness and religiosity on pre-adolescents' role in bullying. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on implementing bullying prevention efforts at other group contexts beyond schools? Do you see interventions such as Kiva applicable at other group contexts where children have regular, repetitive interactions such as congregation, after-school programs, camps, or sports leagues? Any concerns in doing so? My question arises given the emphasis of bullying as a group phenomenon and our focus on school-based interventions. Yet some communities are so tight-knit that children attend the same schools and congregations and sports leagues, etc. Thank you.
Tina?
Yes. Yeah, I think that it's absolutely worth doing and important and possible. I don't see any, I don't see any negative thing that comes to my mind of that, yes, because in social groups that are together on a steady basis, bullying is really likely to raise head, unfortunately, in many of those. And I think that and these kind of preventive interventions, they are really at place also out of the school context, absolutely. However, when there is a bullying problem in a classroom, it should be addressed in the classroom because it's the norms of that group that often maintain the problem there. And even if some kids get the same preventive intervention in some other context, when they come together as a different group, where some of them have had the intervention out of the school, but some haven't, it's not likely to transfer so easily maybe to that group in which they spend their school days. But otherwise, yes, why not?
Jonathan, this will probably be the last question.
So I have excuse me, this is Jonathan Todgers. I have a clarifying question about the research on race and ethnicity. I'm unclear on whether you're talking about race or ethnicity. They're not coextensive, right? So when you talk about things that the research shows that teacher diversity, is this research that's talking about having more, let's say in majority white communities having more teachers of color, or is it specific ethnicities that reflect the student makeup? And then the same for the other research where you're talking about the impact of race or ethnicity. Could you just clarify what the research says about which is it that matters?
Right. So yeah, that we didn't look at the match of the composition of the school to the composition of the adults, but we looked at we didn't look at if the majority was white, is the majority of teachers white, but we just looked at the composition of who was, so what was their background. So from in terms of their background. So it's about having a diversity in terms of their background. Does that answer? Did I make it clear?
Sorry, do you mean
So
their racial
white-
background or their ethnicity?
Their ethnicity.
Well, and Jonathan, I'm specifically differentiating between what we think of as visible racial characteristics and culture. My graduate student from Nigeria points out that she comes from a face culture. My stereotype is that face cultures are usually an Asian culture. Not true in her case. We also know that other African immigrants come from honor societies. So in terms of what that means, in terms of how they're going to, what's going to be insulting, how they're going to react, and whether teacher intervention is going to calm them and get riled or rile them up, is going to depend on the culture more than the racial characteristics. The actual frequency may be more close, the victimization may be more closely linked to observable physical characteristics.
We have one more from the webcast. This is from Dr. Lynn Mock from the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. And she says, is there a tipping point in terms of racial and or ethnic composition of a school that is related to racial or ethnic or immigrant bullying? How large must the minority group become before the individuals become bullying targets?
So we just ran, this is Wendy, so these are correlations, so I can't speak to a tipping point. I can sort of speak to in terms of risk. So it was, so the second largest majority was at the most risk for being victimized. And so that says to me that that's about those intergroup dynamics, right? That the size of whatever that group matters because it means that they have the potential to become the majority. So they're trying to become the in-group. They're the biggest threat to the majority. But there's no number in terms of the number of teachers or the composition because it was a correlational analysis, so there's no tipping point number.
Sandra, you and Jana have done work. I was just asking, kind of throwing it over to Sandra, because she and Jana Jehoven have done some work kind of related.
I think that's a really hard question. We talk about it often as the critical mass. What's the critical mass of kids like you that need to be in the school for you not to feel victimized, for you to feel like you belong and you are connected? And I don't think we yet know the answer to that. I think in American research on victimization and looking at it in the broader, research in general on victimization, American being an example, we haven't really done enough work on the racial ethnic composition of schools and communities and teaching force. Teachers in the U.S. are predominantly white, so it's hard to find that diversity that Wendy would be finding in her studies. But it's clear that more groups, more evenly represented, all else being equal, is better because there's more balance of power. But at what point does the representation of your group really matter in terms of reducing your vulnerability? I think we haven't done enough studies yet to answer that question definitively. It's a really important one.
Well, I guess we should take the question from Beth since she's our funder.
I just wanted to raise from our bullying workshop that we had last spring that there was a paradigm presented from the individual's perspective kind of tackling this issue, that if an individual was being victimized in a homogeneous perspective, their sense of resiliency or response, if I remember correctly, was they're going after me, kind of an internalization approach, versus if I'm unique to my community, I'm being picked out because I'm different, then my frame of reference of why this happened or my response was more I'm being harassed. It was a different framework and almost a different approach to resiliency. So I just want to throw that if the group has something to say. But I think there was some interesting constructs that were presented from the workshop that separate the group phenomenon that you all are raising to how the individual might respond to the actual event.
This is Wendy speaking. The way that I think about it is I also think that resiliency is a relational construct. And so we can become resilient, or become resilient in the face of buffers, in the face of healthy relationships, right? So, related to the work that I'm talking about in terms of, let's say, the racial majority, the teacher role, in the face of diversity in the teachers and healthy relationships with kids, then that resilience can unfold and that child will be less likely to be victimized. And the kinds of attributions that are made about it are less likely to be victimized, are differentiated. So I think, resiliency is able to unfold in the context of resilient relationships. And so the kinds of attributions that we make around that, or the individual motivations around that, always interact with the context and the relationships.
This is Christina speaking. I would like to mention one thing that has been puzzling me a lot because, we know also from some studies that we have done that when there are many in your school or classroom who are victimized, in addition to you attribute it to different reasons, and then you don't feel so bad about yourself being bullied, whereas when you are the one who is picked on, you feel worse and you are worse adjusted. And in the context of interventions, it can also be, and we actually have just been testing it, that when victimization rates go down generally in the school or in a classroom, those remaining victims who remain, the few who are still victimized, feel really the worst, and their adjustment is decreasing. So it's really worrisome. And it means that we really, when we are doing intervention work, even if we can see that for many students it gets better, and the overall proportion of victims gets lower, there might still be this drawback that the few victims who still remain to be victimized, they can really be in a highly difficult situation due to these attributions that they make in such a situation.
Well, I want to thank you very much for the people that have participated in the WebEx and for the people that are here in the room. We'll go ahead and take a lunch break now. We'll reconvene at 1 p.m. Thanks again.